Hi drama nerds, welcome. Jane goes for a run while listening to a podcast about preparing for divorce. Her husband Dan behind her and tries to keep up with her, begging her for some time. They have been married for so long that grievances have built up between them. She runs quickly to the road, circling a pond, and Dan finally succeeds in stopping her. Jane complains about his appearance, but he is puzzled. She has changed too. He then points out the beauty of the pond and suggests that they take a picture together. Jane agrees and stands next to him by the pond. After the picture is taken, Jane prepares to resume her run, confused as to why Dan came with her. The night before, he had gotten drunk at a party, ruining what was supposed to be a celebration of her promotion. Her colleagues are shocked by his behavior, especially since he managed to harass even an elderly accountant. When Jane remembers this, she starts running again, with Dan chasing after her. He quickly loses his rhythm and begins to slow down to a walk. As Jane pushes herself hard along the forest path, she notices a masked man standing with his back to her on the side of the road. She doesn't pay much attention to him and speeds up. Meanwhile, Dan feels a sharp cramp in his head. Jane also hears a sharp sound and stops moving. After a moment, everything returns to normal. Dan continues walking and Jane resumes running, and they eventually reach the starting point of their run, but Dan is not there. She stops and looks around. Meanwhile, Dan stumbles into the bushes and starts running slowly when something bumps into him. He complains but finds no one around when he looks back. Confused, he scans the area. Jane also hears strange noises. Eventually, Dan finds a barrel on the side of the road. The water inside is stagnant and full of trash, and there is a pair of headphones floating on the surface. The headphones look exactly like Jane's. At that moment, Jane appears, insisting that she wants to show him something strange. Dan runs after her, but he quickly loses his breath. He begs her to stop and listen to his apology. He admits that she is right. There are several paths they could take in their marriage, but Jane points to a sign indicating the starting point and notices that the path itself is missing. Dan suggests that there may have been two signs, but Jane can't remember another. She starts running again and Dan tries to keep up with her, begging her to stop because his head hurts, but she only increases her speed. Eventually, they stop at the sign again. Dan calculates that they've circled the road 4 times, but Jane insists that they've only completed one, and the path is still missing. Dan looks in the nearby bushes, but nothing changes. They begin to realize that something is very wrong. Every time they circle the pond, it feels like they're starting over. Dan suggests that they split up and go in different directions. Jane agrees. Before parting, Dan apologizes to his wife. He admits that their long marriage can drive him crazy sometimes, but he still loves her deeply. Jane then leaves. She soon finds herself at a sign that says no swimming and looks around. Nothing changes. The same thing happens to Dan. He found no way to the city. They both tried to reassure themselves, hoping that everything would be okay. Suddenly, they bump into each other. Jane yells at Dan for scaring her, but he tells her to stay put while he runs away. Jane responds in confusion. She notices flashes near the pool as if someone is taking pictures, but Dan suddenly bumps into her, startling her again. He acts like he hasn't seen her in a long time and claims he couldn't find the path. Jane admits she's scared and Dan apologizes. The pair return to the no swimming sign and stare at it in silence. Dan asks Jane if she's hearing a ringing in her ears, but she dismisses it as a hangover. He then asks who would want to swim in the dirty, algae-covered pool. Jane agrees, saying she hasn't seen any swimmers either, but why is the sign there? Jane speculates that the sign might be the reason no one is swimming there, and asks Dan to remove it. He tries to grab it from the ground, but fails. Jane then decides to call someone. As she pulls out her phone, the headphones fall to the ground. However, she quickly realizes that there is no signal. Dan also checks his phone, confirming that there is no network coverage. They follow the trail in hopes of finding a signal, but to no avail. The pair soon pass the barrel of spoiled water again, but Jane insists that they keep moving. They run and run until they suddenly see a man in a hooded sweatshirt standing with his back to them. They shiver and turn and run in the opposite direction. Once again, they find themselves at a no swimming sign. This time, Jane notices a pair of headphones on the ground. She picks them up and looks at the identical pair in her hands, puzzled. Frustrated, Jane attacks Dan. accusing him of playing an elaborate prank on her for getting mad at him the night before. Dan asks how he managed to move the trees, but Jane refuses to listen, demanding that he stop messing with her. Dan then suggests that they go straight through the woods. They wander through the dense trees for a long time until Jane gets tired. They should have found something by now. This is not an isolated wilderness area, but there are no houses, no people, and no signs of civilization. Eventually, Dan asks for a break. At that moment, Jane begins to hear a ringing in her ears as well. Dan laughs, noting that she doesn't even have a hangover. Jane suggests that they try to remember the highway that passes by the park, but neither of them can figure out which direction it goes. Dan tries to start a conversation, but Jane dismisses it as inappropriate and fills her with violent thoughts of stabbing him in the neck. She finds him useless. He snores, doesn't take care of himself, and has bad breath. She can't take it anymore. Shocked by her honesty, Dan reminds her that they've been together for a long time and that everything always seems the same, as if they're stuck in a dream. Jane explains that she just wants to be happy with someone else while he dies alone. Unexpectedly, Dan agrees, calling it fair. They'll probably never forgive each other, and once they run away, they'll start divorce proceedings. Jane suggests that Dan move in with his mother, but he declines, saying that his mother adores Jane. Jane assures him that this is not true, that his mother has always lied to him. They will have to send notices about their separation. Awkwardly, they continue walking, and Dan chooses a direction. They run through the woods and find themselves at the pond once again. Jane breaks down, refusing to accept reality, and repeatedly screams. They take off running and soon find themselves at the sign once again. Jane screams in frustration while Dan starts laughing, convinced that this must be a cruel joke. After some time, they sit on the ground, unable to decide what to do. Suddenly, they hear a man's voice telling someone to run, but no one is around. Dan tries to make sense of what is happening, while Jane calmly says that someone should advise them to run. The couple continue walking along the path. They see the masked man again, but this time he is running away into the woods. They chase after him and catch up to him, only to find him standing with his back to them. They muster up the courage to approach him and ask him questions, but he does not answer or turn around. Jane urges Dan to talk to him, but Dan hesitates. The man throws a small rock, but the person doesn't react. Jane then taps him on the shoulder before quickly backing up behind Dan. Suddenly, another hooded figure walks past them, and the first man finally turns, yelling at them to run. They are shocked to find that the man looks exactly like Dan. Dan blinks in surprise, then turns to Jane, only to see another hooded man behind her. Before he can react, the man brutally stabs Jane with a sharp stick. In a panic, Dan runs into the woods. He stumbles back to the road, apparently bumping into someone, and is heard angrily complaining about being hit on the ground. Dan quickens his steps, chased by flashes of his bloodied wife screaming. Finally, Dan finds himself back at the pond. He is lost, unable to decide what to do next, when he suddenly hears screams from the woods, urging him to run. At that moment, he stumbles into Jane. He tells her to stay there and runs away, ignoring her screams. Dan retreats to a tree where he vomits. After gathering his strength, he returns to Jane, unable to comprehend how she could still be alive. Eventually, he suggests they head in a different direction, and the bewildered woman follows him. They walk for a long time, only to come upon a familiar no swimming sign once again. Dan wonders aloud who would swim in such a dirty pond. Jane replies that people would if the sign wasn't there, and picks up a tangled pile of headphones from the ground. Her own headphones, however, remain safe in her pocket. Dan notices that Jane's shoulders are sunburned and suggests calling someone, but the sign is still missing. Frustrated, he walks back down the path with Jane following him. As they walk through the woods, Dan suddenly turns to Jane, promising not to lose her, and assuring her that they will get out of there. Jane, confused, doesn't understand what he's talking about. Dan insists that once they escape, they will start appreciating each other again. Out of nowhere, another Dan appears, hits the first Dan over the head with a stick, and runs off to vomit nearby. The new Dan angrily complains that Jane never told him how bad his hair looks. Jane, completely confused, responds when he asks her to take off the shirt he is wearing. As she does so, she accuses this Dan of not realizing that she is from a different time loop. Jane puts on the second Dan's shirt, confidently confirming that they are the same person. Meanwhile, the injured Dan regains consciousness. The second Dan begins to beat himself up in an unrealistic manner. Jane, unable to take it any longer, kills the first Dan with a branch. Echoes of their argument over the party and the screams urging them to run reach their ears. This version of the couple tries to collect themselves, struggling with the strange situation when they see other versions of themselves on the road. Dan is horrified by his appearance, having seen himself from the outside, but Jane silences him, pointing out that the other couple has not yet realized that they are stuck in multiple time loops. Dan suggests that he follow the other versions, but Jane objects and begs him not to leave her again. They should not be separated. She believes this version of Dan is good, but what if an evil version appears? He joins her, pondering the clones, and suggests that if time loops exist, then there must be different versions of them as well. Maybe somewhere they are happy, but Jane is convinced that they are stuck in hell together. When Dan hears the word hell, he considers the possibility that they are already dead, were hit by a car or attacked by a bear. At least that would explain things, but Jane interrupts him and tells him to stop talking because she is exhausted. She instead speculates that the aliens may have crashed too close to Earth, and as usual, they were unlucky enough to be caught in the epicenter of an earthquake. At that moment, they hear voices, another pair of Dan and Jane arguing. Jane notes that they look good, while Dan notes that they look cute when they fight. The other versions of themselves run off in different directions, and Jane speculates that this may all be some kind of lesson. If they learn that, they might be able to fix everything. However, Dan believes that only the best versions of themselves will survive. At that moment, another Dan appears, only to be killed in front of them. Unable to bear the sight, the pair leave. Jane asks Dan to hunt for food, but he reminds her that they haven't seen a single animal. They wander through the woods for what seems like an eternity until they find a trail. Suddenly, Jane wonders aloud what she could be doing out here alone. Dan interprets this as a sign that she's reconsidering the divorce. Jane reminds him that she's already killed him once, so maybe he should just keep quiet. At that moment, she hears another scream from the woods telling them to run. They continue walking. Suddenly, Jane collapses, panicking at the thought of dying here. Dan tries to comfort her, even as she insults him in desperation. She's losing her mind, unable to distinguish between good and evil anymore. In an attempt to calm her down, Dan kisses her, and they realize that despite everything, they still love each other. Dan apologizes for all his mistakes, and Jane does the same. Jane then discovers a makeshift tent in the woods. The pair cautiously approach and find inside a tangle of Dan's headphones and phone, as well as the badly decomposed body of one of his clones. They both realize there is no escape. They will never be able to get out. Faced with this horrific truth, they confess their love for each other. At that moment, a hooded figure emerges from the woods and quickly kills this version of Dan. Jane attempts to flee, but stumbles upon the remains of one of her versions. She runs to the lake, encountering two versions of herself with two Dawn along the way. She wades through the water and swims to the other side of the pond. Once on the shore, she rests on a large rock, but then notices a silver ball in the bushes. As she stares at her reflection, she is killed by another version of herself, wearing a dirty hoodie. Later, the hoodie-wearing Jane drags her prize, her newest replacement, back to her camp, where another version of Dan eats the raw flesh of one of their versions. It is clear that one version of the couple has realized that she needs food and has resorted to cannibalism to survive in this endless purgatory. The story is clearly a metaphor for marriage. Two people are stuck in an endless cycle of failed attempts to change each other, venting years of pent-up bitterness and frustration. Only when faced with difficult circumstances do they learn to rely on each other and accept their partner's flaws. Thanks for being with us. Peace.